Last episode, we talked about getting your podcast out into the real world. Now we're jumping back into the digital space to see what we can do there. Welcome to Geelong Podcasters, your weekly podcast for tips and tricks to grow your audience. We are a group of passionate podcasters located in Geelong and the Bellarine in Victoria, Australia. If you're down our way at the end of the month, why not come to one of our free monthly meetup events? And also, find the booking links and more in the show notes. As I mentioned in the intro, last time we talked about how to get your podcast out there, promoting it in the real world. Now we're going to jump back online, where I'm sure a lot more of us are a lot more comfortable with that, to talk about the three main factors when advertising or promoting your podcast in an online space. No need to stress, this stuff is probably stuff you already know, but a nice way to rethink about it. So the things we're going to touch on today are sharing your website and blog, using social media, and collaborating with other podcasters. Now don't wait, it's okay. Even though this may be stuff that you're already familiar with, the stuff we're going to touch on in today's podcast are hopefully going to reinvigorate your love for the podcast using these methodologies. And if not, we'll see if you're up to scratch with them. So we're going to touch on with sharing your podcast or blog first. So if you've got a website or blog for your podcast, and as someone who runs a lot of podcasts for clients, as well as myself, I highly recommend having at minimum a blog or a web page or some sort of online platform that's not a free social media account to promote your podcast, to make sure it's front and center. This is a place where you have full control over how your podcast looks and feels in a digital space. You can embed your latest podcast episodes in blogs and be able to give detailed show notes, which will show up on the SEO platforms to be able to be seen online when people are searching for your type of content. And if you have it on dedicated pages within your blog, it'll make it easier for people to find you out in the wild than just you begging for likes and subs like they do out in the real world. Also, in this website, you can add a short teaser or a summary to make visitors more curious enough to listen or subscribe to your podcast, or as we like to call it now, follow, because that's what all the buttons on most of the platforms are now saying. You follow a podcast, you don't subscribe. Subscribing is where you pay money. The reason that this works is because your website is a perfect place to connect the dots between your brand, what you do, as also the podcast itself. And using a website or a blog can also ask your audience to subscribe and get more details like the show notes, like I mentioned before, so that people regularly interact with your content outside of just listening and downloading your podcast, to keep the momentum going, to eventually maybe build up a loyal community, to eventually get more sponsorships, or in the future to be able to get more charity traction going for your cause. The second thing that I want to touch on is social media. I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, have a social media platform either for our podcast or for our main brand that we run our podcast through. Why? Because it's free. I totally understand where you're coming from. But if you're not on social media, you need to have at least some presence on social media. And if you do have a video podcast, TikTok is the place to be. But don't worry, if you don't have a video podcast, well, there are plenty of ways around it, which we get through in previous podcasts that we've had here at the Geelong Podcasters. I love posting snippets and behind the scenes of my content to get people hooked without giving everything away, so they actually go and listen and or watch my podcast episodes. The platforms that I choose is very much based on the audience that I want to attract. So this will then determine if you spend most of your time on Facebook, TikTok, X, Threads, like whatever audience you're trying to cultivate is where you're going to be on social media. Making sure that you actually have a habit of posting at least once a week. I would recommend at least twice a week to be able to show that you have quality over quantity and be able to do consistently over time. And don't forget to use your hashtags. Now, of course, don't use all of them like we did in the old days, like 30 plus. Maybe stick to around 5 or 7 at max. And if you want, feel free to use the hashtag Geelong Podcasters to help more listeners find you, because you're part of our community. And the third thing I want to touch on, which I'm sure some of you have either been interested in or you have joined our Geelong Podcasters groups to collaborate with other podcasters, is collaborating with other podcasters. This is my favorite way of team working with other professionals who actually know and care about what you do. And to do this, essentially, you reach out to other podcasters who are in similar or parallel niches to you that you can use to cross-promote your podcasts It's best that you choose podcasts that have a similar audience amount or who have about a growth as you do. So say, for example, if your podcast is only 3 months old and you're trying to get a collaboration with someone who's been doing it for 5 years, it may not be the best method. But if you've got similar audiences and similar levels of growth, it could be a great part for you. You should make sure to shout out their podcast episodes on your social media too and on your website to get that good SEO boost, but also you've done a podcast with them, so make sure that you share the love. Go big or go home, make sure to be the best guest that you can on their podcast, and they will do the best in kind for you because you are promoting yourselves to a new potential audience who are already going to like the stuff that you do. Don't be afraid to pitch your podcast to these potential collaborators. And we have a template that I can provide if you would like. And if not, you can access that on our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. All you need to do is look that up. Well, join, of course. And you can look that up and gain access to that to be able to pitch these potential podcasters. You'd be surprised how many people are up for it, especially if you provide plenty of value as you do so. So just before we finish up, let's recap everything we talked about. Make sure to share your episodes on your website and blog. Remember, you own everything. Make sure to get active on social media, the platforms that people care about, and to collaborate with your fellow podcasters who are around the same level of growth or podcast following as yours. I promise that promoting online doesn't have to be a big, scary task. You can do it small and chunk down your task to make it chill and authentic so you can slowly start growing the amount of work that you do, both online and in person. Thank you for hanging out with me today on the Geelong Podcast. It's been a little bit longer than normal, but I wanted to make sure that I cover everything for you. Make sure to check out next week where we are going to be discussing podcast analytics, the basics of podcast analytics for those who have been asking me questions about it. This podcast is sponsored by me, Zoe, the Video Confidence Coach, connecting the dots of your personal brand with the power of video. See more in the show notes. Speaking of show notes, see all the show notes, including links, upcoming events, and details for this episode and many more in the episode description, or just go to vcc.training/Geelong-podcasters. Make sure you tune in for next week.